Some companies who have not been very successful have had the chief knowledge officer in the IT department. The reason they were not necessarily very successful is because somebody coming from a purely IT background has an initial bias towards just rolling out a system. So if you are an IT person, you're thinking about, well, let's install a portal. Let me give you a case in point. Almost a year ago now, I was in outside of Bangalore, I believe. Harry, correct me if I'm wrong. And there was a conference called CIOL. It was 125 top CIOs in the country. And I knew that people weren't inclined to raise their hands, so I asked the questions in reverse order. I said, how many of you CIOs have a portal? And every single one of them raised their hand. I guess they were proud of it or didn't want to, whatever. But it proved to me that they would raise their hand because, you know, that's oftentimes a problem. My next question was, and it was the reason why I was there at the conference to give a speech on knowledge management, how many of you know anything about knowledge management? And not one hand raised. So these people were willing to raise their hand. They just proved it. 125 said they had a portal. But not one of them knew anything or enough to raise their hand and say, I know something about knowledge management. So that's the kind of experience we've had in many organizations. They install a portal but don't know anything about knowledge management. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with IT leadership because they're usually very strategic. And usually technology is an important part of knowledge management. But if it's totally driven by just rolling out a portal, you know what you're going to end up with? A pile of crap, a violation of the first principle, right? Violation of the first principle. So on the other side, I think what you need is a person who's responsible, who's a fairly senior person in an organization, backed by the top people, the CEO. But that person can't possibly have all the skills and competencies necessary to pull this off. They need to have a team of people. And so our training programs are geared towards specialty areas. So somebody on that team needs to be great at metrics. Somebody on that team needs to be great at project management. Somebody needs to be a technologist, etc. So it's a diversified or what we call multidisciplined team. But there needs to be leadership at a pretty high level in the organization, and the team needs to be pretty diversified. Very good question.
Thank you.
Hopefully I answered it.
Yeah. Can we move on to Hyderabad? Hyderabad?
Yes. I have a question. Taking forward what Douglas said about having a specialist kind of thing in a particular team for knowledge management, we have two kinds of people, perfectionists and professionals. Now, do you think it would be viable if this team is rotated because the perfectionists keep helping the professionals and the professionals get into the perfectionist team? Do you think a revolving kind of perfectionist team will help the organization?
Absolutely. In fact, during the strategic process, there are various parts of that strategic process that would definitely call on different kinds of capabilities on that team. So early on in the methodology, the team would be very much into what we'll call an auditing or an assessment mode, trying to find out in this organization what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, where are our opportunities. That's a different kind of a person than a little later on in the process where we've actually now selected some kind of a strategy. And the implementation and change management takes different kinds of skill sets. There needs to be a continuity. You just can't say one team's going to do something and 3 months later another team's going to start off from scratch because there's a substantial learning curve. And that learning curve, that memory in that team needs to stay there and be transitioned over to the next part of the team. But clearly some skill sets will vary. So I absolutely would think that there'd be some rotation. But there needs to be some continuity as well, for sure. Good question.
Calcutta? Calcutta, do we have a question?
Yeah, I'm Narayan Sharma from Calcutta. This is my first introduction to a formal discussion on knowledge management. And in terms of what I have looked at it from the common sense point of view and from practical experience, I work in an old economic company, and I would imagine that technologically there could be 10-20 years kind of gap between, say, the developed countries, the kind of companies which are there in the developed countries in my line of business, and my company. But essentially, I look at it here, the way I look at it, it's a problem of really capturing the information that is created, that is acquired, that is developed by or in an organization, and more importantly, making it available or making it accessible in times of necessity or to the people who really need it. You mentioned about the problems of why people do not share information. The very first point, if I recollect correctly, is the fear of or the threat of losing competitiveness. And the very last was, I think, the organization culture. I would tend to agree, and I would say that these two, at least in my perception, in our kind of organization, these are the two most important issues, with a little change that the very first point, it's not really losing competitiveness. Internally, if I look at within the organization, it is more of losing power. I mean, if I have a certain technical knowledge, I have solved a problem for a client, for a customer, a technical problem. I mean, I work in a specialty, say lubricants kind of business. I mean, if a customer has faced a problem, I have solved that problem, I have developed a product which will sort of tackle that problem. I want to keep it all to myself and not really share it. I mean, that golf ball experience or the example that you gave, everybody would like to collect golf balls rather than giving it away.
Well, that's first of all, you gave a very good summary of knowledge management, and I certainly agree with you in terms of that it's very much common sense. So we talked about better ways just to do brainstorming, and a lot of these things don't require very sophisticated companies with millions and millions of dollars of IT infrastructure. But getting back to the bottom line, the core, as you said, there is that wanting to keep my little golf ball and not share it. And that's why I think we have to make it...
And keep collecting what somebody else can offer me.
Well, I think that is probably human instinct to do that. But if all you do is collect golf balls, you're going to have a bunch of white golf balls. I think the golden nuggets, so I mean, it would take some more conversation on our part to ferret out how this would work in your environment. But I think rather than having 30 of these white golf balls, these are going to be my competitive advantage in the future. So just sitting here collecting stuff, in other words, if the company is into knowledge management and builds a knowledge base, one of the purposes for a knowledge base is to have a collection of all these white golf balls. But if you look at the connect and collect model, the discussion that comes around solving the next problem is where the real brilliance comes out and the real innovation. And I personally don't want to just sit back and have the knowledge base at my fingertips. I want to be involved in the conversations that are creating these, because that's how I'm going to really keep my power. But that's a conversation we can.
Right.
So how you make that practical is.
I think the biggest challenge is, at least in my view, in the kind of organization that I am familiar with, it's not so much the technology, but creating a culture in which this knowledge management, knowledge exchange, knowledge sharing, and enrichment can take place.
Well, I totally agree with that.
That's really the softer issue.
Right. I totally agree with that, and that's why I mentioned that personal KM is very important, because that gets the people into that cultural mindset, that we're in the knowledge age now, not the information age. There's no easy answer to these questions, but you're on the right track, and I think you are right that in some cases it's very much common sense. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Douglas, may I add something here?
Yes.
Add to what Mr. Sharma said from Bangalore. I think we need to have a personality profile of the CKO in terms of congruent communication, positive attitude, timeliness, and transparency in all that he does. I would call this as the cat with a double T. That's what will build the corporate culture and value for respecting knowledge and information. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. And fortunately,
thank you.
The U.S. government has done extensive work on defining the skills and competencies for Chief Knowledge Officer. So we have already a well-researched, not just a document, but well-researched body of knowledge about what kinds of skills and competencies, and in the form of training programs, what kind of learning objectives are going to lead to those skills and competencies, and we're well along in that process. I totally agree with you that we need to define that. A person cannot perform unless they know and have the skills and competencies to be able to perform.